come in, please?
No, you can't come now. I'm just coming now. Where you want to come in for?
I'll explain, because it's a bit sensitive, so we'd like to come in and speak to you properly, please.
She also had a scarf on her neck and a stocking. I think the scarf was underneath her neck, round the back, and the stocking over the top.
No.
On a peaceful night of the 27th of June, 1967, a 75-year-old grandmother went to bed alone, like always. Around midnight, mysterious sounds echoed in the quiet streets, but nobody paid attention. They didn't know these were Louisa Dunn's last terrified pleas for help. She would never be heard from again. Cops put everything into this investigation, searching for a monster who ruthlessly targeted an old, harmless lady. They hunted for years, thinking they'd searched every corner. But half a century later, one small piece of preserved evidence would reveal a horrifying truth.
You've been arrested before? Have you been arrested before?
The man they'd been chasing had already been arrested once before, and they let him go. Now, the question remained, would Louisa's family ever get the justice they'd given up on? 58 years ago, Louisa, or Louise Dunn, used to live alone in Britannia Road, Easton. This frail lady, standing at just 5 feet 3 inches, had been widowed twice before. Though she had 2 children and a granddaughter from her first marriage, the family had drifted apart, so Louisa mostly relied on her neighbors.
This here is where Mrs. Dunn lived a long time ago.
Those who know her say the grandmother was a feisty, opinionated woman, adored by the neighborhood. Every day you could see her at her front door chatting with neighbors or watching the world go by. This deep connection with her community is exactly why her sudden silence felt so wrong. At 75, Louisa still had so much life left in her until someone snatched it from her. Strangely enough, no one came to check on her until it was too late, especially when they'd heard her. On the evening of June 27th, Louisa Dunn visited her neighbor and best friend of 30 years, Alice Clark. It was like their little ritual, 2 old ladies sharing stories over tea. Just after 7:30 p.m., Louisa said goodbye and walked the short distance home alone like always. But this time, someone sinister had been watching her every move. Right next door to her house lived Violet Fortune, a close companion of Mrs. Dunn.
Mrs. Fortune considered Mrs. Dunn to always have been a good neighbour. They had a routine whereby Mrs. Fortune would leave the previous day's newspaper on the front garden wall for Mrs. Dunn.
That night, she saw her neighbor at her house, safe and sound. Violet went to bed until a sound shook her awake at 11:45 p.m. It was strange, like a muffled cry. Violet got up and looked at the window, but saw nothing. Maybe she thought it was some kids messing around. But 2 minutes later, the cry came again. This time, you could tell it was a woman. Fortune could also hear another voice, but couldn't make out anything else. She stood frozen, listening as the night fell silent again. In the end, she did what so many do in the dark, convinced herself it was nothing, and she wasn't the only one. Just a few doors down, another neighbor, Harold Hodson, had heard a chilling scream, clearly a woman's. It was followed by moans or someone trying to stop her from calling out again. Harold told himself that maybe a husband was beating his wife, a bitter reality many have ignored countless times. A few moments later, it stopped, and he went back to bed as well. These mysterious sounds in the dead of night would be evidence of someone maliciously attacking Mrs. Dunn. Help was heartbreakingly out of reach. The next morning began like usual, but something was amiss. You couldn't figure it out until it dawned on the neighbors. Mrs. Dunn hadn't been out yet. This was extremely out of character for the meticulous woman. Concerned, Violet went to check on her old neighbor. For the rest of her life, she would never forget what she saw.
Knocked, no answer. Then she climbed up on the sill there and could peek through the top and see that Miss Dunn was on the floor. And then Mum climbed in through, opened the window and climbed through. And then they got the door open.
They thought maybe she fell ill, but that was just wishful thinking. A closer look would reveal the nightmarish truth. She was fully clothed, but her underwear was around her ankles. Someone had brutally violated the old lady in the worst possible way. Desperately trying to move on from the sight, they rushed to see if she was alive. Unfortunately, it was too late. The attacker had not only ripped her modesty, but also her last breath. Her mouth and neck were bruised as if something heavy had shut her mouth as they strangled her with a scarf. That explained the sounds neighbors heard at night. The 75-year-old had tried to scream with everything in her, but she was silenced. Who would target an old lady? And more importantly, how did they get in?
It could have been a service, somebody in the services, like a bread man or some delivery man of some sort or something, but they had to have cased her joint.
At first, everyone thought this was a robbery gone wrong. There were clear signs of a break-in. The house's upstairs back window was forced open. The defenseless woman lived alone and was an easy target. This was a plausible theory if you could ignore the biggest aspect. There was nothing to steal. Mrs. Dunn lived a simple life supported by her old age pension. Even her house had nothing valuable except a few books and the deeds to her house. There was no money in the house. Still, someone had intentionally targeted her and ended her life. But if the killer didn't want money, what did he really want from a weak-old woman who had nothing to give except her life? The answer would appear a decade later, when this monster would strike again. This horrific incident shook the entire town. Nobody could wrap their mind around the criminal's actions. It pushed the authorities to take instant action and apprehend the suspect. They launched a full investigation. But did the attacker even leave enough evidence? Back in the late 1960s, they didn't even have enough resources or advanced methods. Their only hope was one single clue. Little did they know, they'd put another major clue hidden on the 75-year-old's skirt in a storage box for years to come. Right now, the only lead detectives had was not even a full handprint, just a partial print of a left palm smudged on the upstairs window glass. At the time, you couldn't tell if it was just random print or did it actually belong to the intruder. Regardless, the only possible lead began a massive manhunt that would end just one street away from the wanted man. To find the attacker, cops knocked on 8,000 doors. They wanted to leave no stones unturned, so they approached every male between the ages of 15 and 60 and those who were already convicted of a robbery or a sexual offense. It led them to gather handprints of 19,000 boys and men. Not one of them matched. Curiously enough, this search radius was limited to about 1.5 miles from Mrs. Dunn's home. If they'd expanded it just by 0.1 mile, they would have come across a house at Picton Street. That's where the 34-year-old deranged criminal lived unsuspectingly with his wife, just 1.6 miles away from the scene of the crime. He would go on to live a free life for the next 50 years, while Louisa's family suffered in agony and shame. At the time, the victim's young granddaughter, Mary Dainton, was 20 years old. She was an art student at a local college when the tragedy happened. Even though the family wasn't that close with the matriarch, the way they discovered what happened shook them to the core.
I picked up the Evening Post, I think it was, and I said, what's on it, the picture? Should we all go to the flicks later? And at the back, they had all the obituaries. And there it was, a tiny little column about my grandmother.
Years later, Mary revealed the depth of their struggles during this incident. She can't forget the stigma attached to her grandma's stolen dignity and tragic demise. It made everyone withdraw from the family as if the victim was at fault. It felt like judgmental eyes were following them everywhere they went. The granddaughter said her mother took it very hard and fell into a lifelong cycle of crippling anxiety.
Caught the bus to see my mum, and I got there and said, is it Gran? And she said yes. And she was in a bit of a state emotionally, but she was so used to putting a brave face on things.
Even the young student felt like her life was turned upside down. They now had to live under the weight of this heartbreaking event. It impacted the family emotionally to the point that it changed how they would keep a normal relationship with people around them. Cops promised them they would bring Louisa and her family justice, but this promise would be fulfilled by a completely new generation of determined investigators. And while the current police were still searching the city, the monster was already moving on to his next victims. At last, the original investigators retired with regret.
Are you at all sad in any way on leaving the force today with any particular crimes unsolved?
Yes. I've had since I've been a chief superintendent, we had the old lady, Louisa Dunn, at Easton in 1967.
Exactly 10 years after Mrs. Dunn's passing, a serial offender rose in Ipswich. This was 200 miles away from the last dreadful incident. In October 1977, two elderly women aged 79 and 84 were cruelly violated in their homes, just like Louisa Dunn. However, the attacker had made the same grave mistake. He again left his fingerprint at the scene. This time, it would definitely lead him behind bars, but serving his sentence was an entirely different thing. Fortunately, or unfortunately, his latest victims lived to tell the traumatic tale.
She is aged 80, a widowed lady. She lives alone at the address given. On the evening, she tried to push his hands away and indeed tried to bite the man's fingers, but this old lady had false teeth which were not in. She was crying at this stage and he removed her bedclothes and said, "Take your knickers off."
One of them described that she was woken by a man crawling across her bedroom floor, threatening to end her. He had his way with the old lady and escaped. Again, a manhunt ensued and fingerprints from 5,000 men were taken in a span of a month. They finally had a match. Sadly, authorities at the time didn't connect these incidents with the past crime. It had the same targeted age group, the same criminal intention, and the same manner of attack. The only difference? This time his victims didn't pass away. Many say, why would they be thinking about a woman's demise 200 miles away? That too 10 years ago. But what if one diligent detective had connected the dots and brought justice to the Dunn family sooner? Louisa's case wouldn't have remained unsolved for almost 40 more years. Even the family had given up.
I accepted it. I accepted that some murders just never get solved. And some people just have to live with that emptiness and that sadness.
For now, at least these two ladies would get justice, barely. When the cops caught this intruder, they charged him with burglary and sexual assault. He pleaded guilty to his crimes and was sentenced to life imprisonment. But here's where a gaping flaw in the justice system appeared that you just can't wrap your mind around. The defendant later filed an appeal backed by medical professionals, stating his wife was ambitious and demanding. She didn't fulfill his needs. The growing frustration led him to force himself on the old ladies. And horrifyingly enough, the court accepted his appeal. His life sentence was reduced to 7 years, even if he had an underlying psychological reason. It made absolutely no sense to cut down on his punishment to this level. What about the elderly victims who had to suffer at his hands, at their tender ages, just because they were left alive? Suddenly, the severity of the crime had lost its value. It will leave you reeling when you discover he actually served just 2 years of his reduced 7-year sentence before he was released. How could a man capable of such horror simply blend back into everyday life for decades more as if he'd done nothing? While the community moved on and forgot his crimes, Louisa Dunn's case files were sealed away in Avon and Somerset's cold case archives. It also contained her original blue skirt, pubic hair samples, and the weak palm print, all waiting for science to catch up. Down the line, when it finally did, it turned out to be a 1 in a billion match. In a twist of fate in 2012, the original offender was again arrested for a petty local dispute. He was never charged for it, but this time, his DNA was collected and added to the national database. Still, he managed to skip out of giving a handprint by claiming he had arthritis. Since crime scene materials from Louisa's case were never properly analyzed or entered into the modern system, the newly collected DNA never matched. It stayed buried for 10 more years when a team of fresh eyes, decades younger than the crime itself, reopened everything in 2023. That's where Operation Beetle came in. That year, Avon and Somerset police launched a project targeting decades-old unsolved murders, hoping to identify felons with the latest advancements in forensic science. Turns out this operation became the first step in the UK's longest-standing solved cold case, Louisa's case. Major Crime Review Officer Joanne Smith led a team of 9 to investigate the case. She says when they opened the dusty boxes, they were amazed at how well the evidence was preserved. If by any chance it had been damaged or contaminated, Mrs. Dunn's chance at justice would have fallen to 0. But since everything was in exceptional condition, forensic scientists Andrew Perry and Heidi Miller had their work cut out for them.
But the back of the skirt basically had semen on and had a full DNA profile.
Wow. What did you think?
Well, it gives me goosebumps.
The DNA from it finally had a hit, a first sign of hope in almost 50 years. The offender now had a name, Ryland Headley.
But at that point, I didn't know whether that person was dead or alive. We knew nothing.
What if during that wait he'd passed away like so many people who originally faced the crime, but they'd come too far to just give? They had to look for him.
We were able to locate him in an address in Bristol, around 1.5 miles away from 58 Britannia Road in 1967 at the time of the offence. And we were able to establish that he disappears, or as best as we can tell, he disappears from records in Bristol shortly after that.
Turns out he'd moved to Ipswich and continued his savage spree. They found his address and went to make him face his crimes. But when they landed on his door, the face they found behind it was the last you'd expect. On November 19th, 2024, detectives arrived at a house in Ipswich. Locals knew the house belonged to a harmless retired railway officer whose wife had passed away. Little did they know, it housed a killer on the loose for decades.
But did he give you any indication that he was someone who's capable of?
Not in the slightest. Simply because of the fact that he kept saying that everybody's is lucky to be in such a great neighbourhood, is lucky to have such great friends.
Ryland still stayed in the same area, living the perfect retired life, where he had previously targeted 2 more elderly ladies back in 1977. As cops knocked on the door, a hunched 92-year-old man barely opened the door and peeked out. He thought he had gotten away with it, but justice was finally ready to collar him for good.
I've just got up. I'm old man.
I'm sorry, it's quite early.
I'm very sick, not good at all.
You're not well?
No.
Okay.
At first, he tried his best to hold them off, pretending that he couldn't understand playing his old age card, but the water was over his head, so he closed off altogether.
And I'm here today because I'm arresting you
Yeah.
on suspicion of the rape and murder
Yeah.
of Louisa Dunn, which happened in Bristol in June 1967.
Yeah.
They took Headley into custody, and now the real race against time began. For the past 58 years, authorities had slacked off, whether due to lack of resources, laziness, or flaws in the justice system. But now, this criminal was in his 90s. They needed to convict him as soon as possible before he gave way to old age. And the first step to do that was to revisit the very first clue left behind by him.
Once Mr. Headley was arrested, had his DNA and live scan fingerprints taken, they were also able to match the palm mark on the frame of the window to Mr. Headley as well.
There was no doubt left anymore. This was the same man who had mercilessly ravaged a 75-year-old woman in his 30s. While he was in custody, the cops tried to get a confession out of him. Yet, the way he acted will chill you to the bone.
Louisa has been attacked. Can you tell me about that?
No comment.
Where did you find her in the house?
No comment.
Or did she find you, maybe?
No comment.
Okay. How did she react to seeing you in the house?
No comment.
There was no hint of remorse on the man's face. If it weren't for proven evidence, you could never tell he had committed those heinous acts. But even with these ironclad forensics, would a jury really convict a 92-year-old man almost on his deathbed? 7 months after Ryland's arrest, his case was officially taken to trial at Bristol Crown Court amid a massive media frenzy. And the piling evidence was undeniable. The DNA the forensics team had extracted was a 1,000,000,000-to-1 match to the retired man's DNA profile, taken back in 2012. It meant he was truly 1 in a billion offenders who could have targeted Louise Dunn. There was no mistake in identifying him. Adding on to it, palm print experts testified that the same partial taken from the deceased grandmother's window had 25 matching points with the defendant's prints. Yet, it was never clear if he actually wanted to take her life.
Did you go in that house intending to kill her?
In the end, his confession or lack thereof didn't matter. The final nail in the coffin proved to be his attacks from 1977. Louisa's incident wasn't a one-time occurrence. It revealed a sick pattern that continued later as well. Headley used to intentionally target and identify homes of middle-aged or elderly ladies living alone or defenseless in his area. It showed his considerable knowledge of the surroundings, meaning he probably stalked them multiple times before ambushing them in the dead of the night. Sadly, the case couldn't call its original witnesses, as many of them had passed away during the long duration. However, their statements were still read in court and taken into account. Meanwhile, despite all these years, the defendant never confessed. Even during the trial, he didn't testify. On the bright side, in this otherwise dark, horrific case, Dunn's granddaughter, Mary Dainton, was still alive, now 78 years old. For the first time in 58 years, she heard the truth, a revelation they had never expected.
Ryland Headley, you've been found guilty by the jury of the murder of Louisa Dunn and of her rape.
On June 30th, 2025, after half a century of delay in justice, the jury unanimously convicted Ryland Headley of sexual assault. On the murder charge, the vote was still 10-2. It seemed two of the jury members believed he didn't mean to take Louisa's life, but if he had tightly clamped his hand over a weak lady's mouth, especially with a scarf around her neck, how did he expect her to breathe? So, just a day later, on July 1st, the judge announced a life sentence with a minimum of 20 years. He is the UK's oldest offender to be convicted of ending someone's life. But at the same time, it makes you wonder if it's really justice that a man in his 90s will spend whatever is left of his days in prison when he spent most of his life roaming free. On behalf of her family, Mary finally had a respected space to voice years of agony.
And it falls to me to speak for people who are no longer here. It saddens me deeply that all the people who knew and loved Louisa are not here to see that justice is done.
Despite this long-awaited conviction, the case has led to more questions. What if Headley's past has been hiding more victims who didn't have any clues tying them to him? How many more of them have been buried without another thought? Louisa's case is Britain's oldest solved cold case, and it is a huge sign on how even the most fragile evidence can lead to conviction half a century later, but only if it is well preserved. But even more importantly, it acts as a warning. The legal system has been crippled due to funding cuts and reduced manpower. But behind these administrative decisions, thousands of cases go unsolved. Their families stay desperate for the truth, and innocent victims like Louise lose their lives in the most gruesome manner possible, only to be forgotten forever. How many more monsters are still living their best lives out there, while their crimes are stuffed inside old evidence boxes in cold case archives? Share your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the justice system failed Louisa? Or was this just a case of forensic limitations and poor fate? If you want to hear about more haunting cases like these, don't forget to hit the subscribe button on your way out. Till then, stay safe and give your loved ones a tight hug. We'll see you in our next video.